The Volkswagen Golf celebrates its 50th birthday this year. And while globally there is a 50-Yara edition, in Malaysia we get things a little bit different. Because our 50th anniversary edition comes in the form of a Golf GTi, which not only comes with new wheels as well as some look-at-me bits, but there is also a new body kit. Although that counts as look-at-me bits, right? In any case, this is a limited edition Golf GTi which they say embodies everything that the GTi stands for. And while we were disappointed the last time we took it out, it remains to be seen if this one will hold water. Now, even though there are some cosmetic upgrades, it is worth noting that there have been no changes to the oily bits. And so up front, we get the vaunted EA888 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, producing well north of 200 horsepower and just under 400 Newton meters of torque. All that power goes to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch DSG gearbox, as well as a limited slip differential in order to improve overall drivability. Now that said, however, what you can see is mostly what you get for the Edition 50 model. So for starters, the headliner is actually the Ettinger body kit that you get as standard on this car. That includes things like a front lip, side skirts, a rear diffuser, as well as an upgraded rear spoiler. All of this to make the car look a little bit more aggressive. Standard features on this car carried over from the regular GTi include full LED headlights, replete with automatic high beam, as well as 5-point LED daytime running lights that live down there, which I think look quite good. But I do think that this Ettinger body kit really does help to underscore and highlight the aggressiveness of this car, and at least it should set it apart from the Golf R line that we had for a little while. Now down the side we get a set of 18-inch alloy wheels unique to the Edition 50, wrapped in Bridgestone Potenza tyres. So these are some properly high-performance tyres as necessary for a GTi, and further underscored by this badging here, just in case you don't know what you're looking at. The black wing mirror caps, however, are standard even with the regular GTi. Now, if you see these in satin silver, that means you've got a Golf R. Moving further down the side, you can see the side skirts that I mentioned earlier, which are part of that body kit, as well as the 50 badge here on the B pillar, again, to denote this as the limited edition model. And as you move further to the rear, you can actually see the side profile of that slightly more aggressive spoiler, which I think does make this car look a little bit more brash. In fact, it looks a little bit more aggressive than a Golf R. Now at the rear, you can see how that spoiler works with the slightly more aggressive rear diffuser, which I think does help to make this rear end look even more aggressive than the already aggressive standard Golf GTi. Now you still get dual exhaust pipes, which on this car sound pretty good, and they're also augmented inside with some fake noise. Now, I'm not a big fan of fake noise, but on a GTi, I think it's sort of within the spirit of the car. Now, behind this tailgate, you will find a pretty decent amount of space. It is not powered, but it doesn't have to be, because the space in here is actually certainly large enough for 4 adults worth of luggage, maybe 5 in a pinch. Now, the Golf GTi is meant to be a hot hatch, which means it has to be a car that you can use daily as well as on the weekends. And so this is something that is certainly fit for daily use. Now, underneath the boot floor, you will find a space-saver spare wheel, but more importantly, you will notice that there is quite a bit of clearance, and that's actually because this car has a dual-level boot floor, which allows you to maximize the vertical space should you need it. Other items back here include a couple of cubbies on either side of that boot floor, as well as a couple of hooks and a 12-volt socket, as well as some lights, which means that this is pretty practical indeed. On top of that, the rear seats can actually be folded 60-40 for added practicality. There's even a ski hatch should you have longer items that you want to keep in the car while you also carry around 4 people. Practical. Now, the Golf GTi is largely driven by sort of yuppie types, and most of these yuppie types usually have sunglasses like mine, but they will find that there is nowhere to put them, so. Now, getting into the Golf GTi Edition 50, you have to step over some unique tread plates, which again denote that this is a limited edition model, and then your feet will rest on a set of unique Edition 50 floor mats, which is kind of part of what makes this car a little bit more special. Now, unfortunately, the seats have not been given any sort of treatment whatsoever, which means the upholstery is exactly the same, with the exact same perforations in order to make room for the heating and ventilation that come as standard on these front seats. Only the driver's seat is powered with 3-stage memory, whereas the passenger seat is manual. You still get GTi stitching on the back, but I would have liked some Edition 50 embossing on the headrest perhaps, but at least I get a 50 badge here on the center spoke of the steering wheel, which I suppose is some consolation. Now, beyond that, nothing else in this car has really been reworked, which means that the rest of the treatment in here is very similar to what we've seen before from other Golf GTIs. So you've got this sort of honeycomb mesh material on the dash front as well as on the doors, which I think certainly looks very special and very sporty. You do get the same seats as I mentioned earlier, which come with pretty decent side bolstering, which is what you need for a car like this, something that will be switching directions very aggressively, and so you want to be kept in your seat at all times. We also get a slightly sportier steering wheel with the same leather wrapping and perforations around your sort of 9 and 3 positions, and it's nice and meaty, so it's nice to hold. And of course, you obviously get paddle shifters on the back in order to manipulate that 7-speed DSG, although honestly, this is such a competent gearbox, so you only really use that when you're driving at its most aggressive. Now, beyond that, you get a couple of digital screens to control your infotainment as well as your instrument cluster. Now, the instrument cluster itself is decently customizable, but it's not that great. But then again, it does present all the information that you want at a glance, which is kind of what you want in a car like this, because this isn't really the important part. Up ahead of me, there's also a full color heads-up display, replete with ADAS functionality readouts as well as speed and cruise control settings, which means that everything just lives within that view. You also get navigational instructions in the heads-up display, which works with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which means that your eyes never really have to leave that screen if you're driving along. Now that's pretty good, because this is not so much. Now, like many other car makers, Volkswagen has insisted that more and more of the functions in this car should be centered in this screen, and that includes your HVAC controls, etc. Now, I find that particularly annoying because this is a Golf GTi, or in fact, even the regular Golf is a car that a lot of people tend to drive quite spiritedly, and so I used to really appreciate the tactility of the knobs and buttons, or the switchgear rather, in order to manipulate the HVAC controls. The Volkswagen Arteon sidesteps this by having dedicated but still touch-sensitive controls on a separate panel, whereas on the Golf GTi, it's all here. On top of that, while you do have some switches here to control your temperature as well as your volume on a slider, not only are they touch-sensitive, but they are also not backlit, which means that at night, you're pretty much screwed. Now that said, this car does come with a voice assistant, and so as a lone driver, it can be quite easy for you to manipulate most of those settings just via voice. But if you have a passenger, good luck. Now that said, however, this screen is at least very responsive to use. It's quite snappy, the graphics are pretty good, and it also comes with wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which means that you can make full use of the wireless charging pad that lives down here. However, if like me, you prefer faster charging and more stable connections, there are also USB-C ports that live up here on the dash, which not the best placement, I think, because it leaves these sort of wires lying around everywhere. But at least you do get, again, that wireless charger, which actually comes with a cover in order to hold your phone in place. You also get sort of Golf badging up here, which I think looks interesting because it was unnecessary, but they put that in there because it is a Golf. Now, as we move further down, there's a small cubby here, which is large enough for you to hold your key, as well as the tiny little gear rocker switch, which is... I've just gotten used to it. As we move further down, there are a couple of cup holders, replete with one that deploys, which is certainly nice, and you also have an adjustable center armrest, which covers this small cubby hole, and you can adjust it to just the right height as well as the right distance in order for you to take in distance pretty well. Let's not forget that the T in GTi stands for touring, which means that this has to be a comfortable car to sit in over longer distances, which is why it's great that this driver's seat comes with lumbar support, and the steering wheel is pretty well adjustable for reach and brake, which means that you can get very comfy in this car. It also helps that there is a dimming rear view mirror here, which is again what you want, particularly if you're driving at night, although it is unfortunate that the side mirrors don't dim as well. And before I move to the rear, I appreciate the fact this car comes with a Harman Kardon audio system, which is really quite good, because as I will tell you about later, you will need that sound system to drown out quite a lot of noise. Now, because the Golf GTi is a hot hatch, as I mentioned earlier, that means that this has to be a car that is decently practical for you to use every day. Now, with the front seat set in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I actually have a pretty decent amount of knee room and a pretty decent amount of headroom. No doubt as a result of this car not coming with any sort of sunroof. And because the front seats are actually mounted quite high, it means I do actually have a decent amount of space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. And when I do have a pretty decent amount of under-thigh support, which means I could do quite a few hours of a journey in this car without too much issue at all. It is merely unfortunate, however, that the rear carpets do not have the same Edition 50 badging, nor do the side sills, which means that the back of this car doesn't feel like you're in a limited edition Golf. I would have also appreciated if there was some sort of badge on the dash front to say, you know, edition 50 or 1 of 50 or something like that. But there we are. Now, life back here as a passenger, however, is not that bad. These rear seats are a little bit more upright than I would have liked, but it's still comfortable. And as I mentioned earlier, you do have decent under-thigh support. I've got a pocket behind the front seat here and 2 more up here to hold small devices. I've got a decently sized door bin, big enough for a litre-sized bottle. I actually have my own climate control back here, as well as 2 USB-C ports, as well as a couple of vents here positioned about your groin. Now, aside from that, this interior does seem a little bit dark, and that's because the Edition 50 actually comes as standard with privacy tint, which means the rear half of the car is actually significantly darker than the front half of the car. Now, this is good if you have children sat back here, because obviously they'll be protected from UV rays. But speaking of children, while there are ISOFIX mounts here, if you have a bulky rear-facing child seat, chances are they're going to be pushing up against the front seats. Volkswagen has thought of this, which is why they provide an ISOFIX mount in the front seat, which means that you can have a bulky seat position there where it can take up more space against the dash, and you can have an adult passenger sat behind it in order to maximize comfort and space, which I think is pretty useful. I've also got a deployable center armrest here with a couple of cup holders, and I think that this design is basically a one-to-one copy of what they give you in a Porsche. But while this car has the ambient lighting, which is customizable into 3 different zones via 64 different colors, it is unfortunate that I don't have that sort of mesh material to break up the monotony of the hard black plastic that you get all the way down the door card. Now, the Golf GTi is well north of 200,000 ringgit, which means that you would expect slightly better quality materials back here, particularly given the fact that other car makers are able to do so. On top of that, the Golf GTi is now locally assembled in Pekan, which means that that should have freed up a little bit more in terms of, you know, taxes and so on, for them to again spend on slightly higher quality materials. And so this is quite disappointing. However, the Golf GTi is largely about the driving experience, which means me waffling on about what the back end of this car is like might be a bit moot. Now, the wonderful thing about the Golf GTi is that for a long time, this was the consummate do-everything car. It was a car that didn't compromise in any one way in terms of practicality, while still offering the sort of driving experience that true enthusiasts would be able to enjoy. And that's largely been the recipe for the GTi, save a couple of missteps, but it feels like this Mark 8 is not quite where I'd expect it to be. See, we said the same thing the first time we drove this car, the non-Edition 50 model, simply because in its attempt to try and make a car that is now more refined and feel a little bit more mature, it's lost the immaturity that made the GTi so lovable. For example, this car is now quieter and slightly more comfortable than the outgoing Mark 7.5. That is certainly some improvement, although to that end it is still not the quietest car in the world, and certainly not as quiet as you'd expect for something that is pushing $250,000 ringgit. And while it's comfortable, yes, more comfortable than the Mark 7.5, but it's not that comfortable either, which again to me feels like it's some degree of compromise. However, it is a compromise worth making if at least this car was particularly dynamically capable. Unfortunately, having driven this car about 700 kilometers, actually took this car on a trip, I can tell you that it's really not quite there. The Mark 7.5, and in fact the Mark 7, was such a great car to drive that it felt like you were dancing on the razor's edge. It felt like it was a car that was set up purely for driving enjoyment, and it did that so well. The trouble is, this car feels like in its attempt to be more mature, it's given up a little bit of that driving fun. So for example, while the steering in this car still has that same Vario rack steering that we saw before, it's not as communicative as the last car. Again, it still feels very direct, still feels very accurate, but it's just not as joyful as it used to be. That's number one. Number two is in terms of the suspension. So as I mentioned earlier, this car has an adaptive suspension setup. So I've set that up, when I set that up rather, to its most comfortable setting. It doesn't quite feel like this car is that comfy. It doesn't quite iron out the lumps and bumps. The primary ride is a little bit too harsh, and the secondary ride is also a little bit stiffer than one might necessarily expect. And then when you dial it up the other way, the car ends up very uncomfortable and very stiff, but I still have not a lot of feedback through the steering wheel. So it's not that great. And then when you're trying to switch directions very quickly, you realize that this car is now quite a bit heavier than the last one, and that weight transfer is very, very noticeable, which takes away from that very chuckable sensation that the GTi has always, or largely always, enjoyed. So you think, okay, the car's become more mature. Does that mean that it's quiet and comfy? No, I explained that already, which means that it doesn't quite fit the bill in any one direction. I've no doubt that the regular Golf TSI, which was discontinued in our market because nobody bought them, I'm pretty sure that would have been a pretty good car to do, everything that you need it to do while still having some degree of dynamic ability, because the Golf has always generally been a very good car to drive, GTi or otherwise. But in the GTi, where you expect it to lean more towards enthusiastic driving, it doesn't seem to quite match up to expectations. Now, of course, those are some of the negatives, but as a whole, the problem that we have within this segment is that in Malaysia, at least, there isn't really much competition anymore. The Toyota GR Corolla is a 300+ thousand ringgit vehicle, which means it competes more in line with the Golf R, not with the Golf GTi. And the GR Yaris, on the other hand, is a two-door, which means that it's not quite as practical as any Golf on the basis that it has two fewer doors. And because the Renault Sport Megane is no longer available in Malaysia, and because everyone has largely abandoned this space in favor of SUVs, you don't really have that much of an option. And so when you take that into account, you take that into context when driving a Golf GTi, and that's when you realize that, okay, you know what, this car does have some merit. For example, as this light goes green, bear in mind I'm not in any special mode, when I put my foot down, the noise in this car, although I understand it is augmented somewhat, is still... That was a BMW, not me. But the noise in the Golf GTi still feels pretty good. It still feels pretty engaging. It feels like I'm in something that is, again, designed for drivers. It's a very satisfying noise, augmented or otherwise. And then when you are sat here, because the Vario rack steering, it also means that you're not really putting in that much steering input at any given time. Going from lock to lock in this car is like a turn and a half at most, which means that it does still feel very direct, albeit completely bereft of any sort of communication or feel. And then this gearbox, this DSG automatic, this double clutch gearbox has something that Volkswagen has essentially perfected. And in the Golf GTi, you can really tell the difference between the various drive modes that you can select in this car, because when you're driving it in sport, it is instantaneous, the shifts. It's just bang and bang and bang. And the moment you touch the paddles, for example, it immediately calls upon the gear that you want, which is very good. And then when you drive it in eco mode, it just slushes the gears together so smoothly that it creates an experience that is almost peerless. This car's ability to provide both aggressive and comfortable driving is very commendable, because this is still ultimately one car. And when you're driving it in eco mode, which is where I suspect the majority of buyers will be most of the time anyway, you realize that this car is also relatively efficient. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I did take in a long drive with this car, and I did that mostly in eco mode because, I'm just sitting on the motorway doing like 110, 120 kilometers an hour. I don't exactly need this car to be in its most aggressive setting. And in doing so, the car returned anywhere between 6.9 to 7.6 liters to the 100. I'm not kidding. One trip north did 7.6, the trip south did 6.9. Then this is still a car with over 200 horsepower. This is still a car that's got really, really good performance chops. I mean, I don't get it. It's magic, this thing. Now, ultimately, does that mean that this is no longer the driver's car it used to be? Yeah. I don't think the GTi is as satisfying to drive in its 8th generation as it was in its 7th. I thought that car was just so much more engaging and so much more joyful to drive, and it felt a little bit more analog. Whereas in here, you feel that there is some degree of digitization occurring at every aspect of this car. And it creates a situation where it just feels a little bit artificial. But that engine note, and I'm saying this as I go through a toll, is just... Let me just put that window up. There is some joy to be extracted with a car that sounds that good. And I think that The Golf GTi is not made for urban dwellers. This is not a car that you'd want to own if you're driving from home to work and back again just through traffic every day, although the ADAS functionalities will help you in that regard. This is a car that's made for people who live a little bit further out of town, whose commute is a little bit further than the national average, because it's only when you're on the motorway like this do you really enjoy what the GTi has to offer. This has turned from a B-road corner carver into something more of a motorway cruiser, but it does so in a very satisfying way, because when the speed picks up and you're just trying to maintain that speed comfortably, this car does do that quite well. It's very confident, it's very stable, and munching miles in this car is of absolutely zero consequence to the driver. On top of that, the Harman Kardon audio system does a very good job at cutting out a lot of the noise that you're hearing right now. As I mentioned, this car is not particularly quiet by any measure. And as a result, you get a lot of wind noise, you get a lot of road noise, but again, the Harman Kardon audio system will cut a lot of that. And I've spent about 5 hours in this car proving that point. So I think that the GTi's brief has shifted slightly. In its aim for maturity, it's lost its sheer dynamic ability. But instead, you get something that feels a little bit more adult, a little bit more grown up. It feels like something that people who are getting a little bit older, who can potentially afford a car like this, will be able to appreciate this car's manners a little bit more. But I do lament that loss of driving dynamics, because the GTi, hand on heart, and I'm genuinely not exaggerating here, the GTi Mark 7 used to bring a tear to my eye when driven on a particularly challenging road, because that car was so flattering. Whereas in this, you just feel cocooned in safety, which is perhaps what buyers nowadays want, but it just means that this is not the driving car that it used to be, which is a shame, because I miss the old GTi. But I don't miss the fact that that car didn't come with any active safety features at all. I appreciate that this car's got full level 2 semi-autonomy, which means that on that long drive, I just set the adaptive cruise control and it did its thing. It helped with the steering, it helped the accelerating and the braking. It did the majority of the work, which meant that the 2-hour drive that I took there and then the 2-hour drive I took back felt truly effortless. It's just that when I turned off the motorway, I was expecting a little bit more joy, and that's where this car falls a little bit flat. Now, I will provide some degree of context here. Because I have a particular affinity for the Golf GTi, perhaps my expectations of this car were particularly high. Now, I imagine that the majority of buyers who don't drive at 10/10ths the way I do might appreciate or might prefer the way the Mark 8 Golf GTi has been set up. But this is not the ultimate driving machine anymore. For that, I think you might be better served in the GR Yaris, which has been facelifted and is coming to Malaysia with an 8-speed automatic transmission, which would mean that that car is now a lot more accessible to a lot more people, rather than just having the 6MT that it used to have. And I'm told that the facelift will also not be a limited edition, although I might be wrong. However, if you think that maybe the GTi is a little bit too loud, a little bit too brash, a little bit too unpolished for you, then you might be better served in something that is a little bit more polished. And for the money, you could get into something like a BYD Seal, for example, which is a lot quieter, a lot more comfortable, while also being rear-wheel drive. Or if you insist on a combustion engine, then the Mazda 3 hatch is about 8/10ths as good as this car is to drive, while offering, again, more refinement, more practicality, a little bit more maturity that is maybe what you're looking for. But ultimately, this review is not going to end on a high note, because I am genuinely sad that this Mark 8 simply doesn't live up to the same standards that the Mark 7 had already set. And it's a shame, because the Mark 7 didn't have the active safety features, which I think are an absolute necessity for a car that will be anywhere near family use, or in fact just doing the daily grind like I am now. In any case, that concludes our review of the Volkswagen Golf GTi Edition 50. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.